Among history's most feared and controversial names, two men stand whose actions still haunt the pages of time: Joachim von Ribbentrop of Germany and Arthur Seyss-Inquart of Austria. Each played a direct role in shaping the darkest years of the 20th century as architects of tyranny and enablers of war. Let us begin with the first, Joachim von Ribbentrop. Joachim von Ribbentrop was born on the 30th of April in the year 1893 in Wesel, a town situated in the Rhine province of what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. What turned a wine merchant's son into Hitler's trusted diplomat? How did a man once mocked as unintelligent climb to the very peak of Nazi power? And what secrets did his early travels and ambitions foreshadow in the world he would later help to destroy? Please watch my full video until the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. Joachim's father, Richard Ribbentrop, was a career military officer, and young Joachim's early years were shaped by both discipline and displacement. The family moved often, and despite their noble-sounding surname, they struggled with limited finances after Richard was forced to resign from the army in 1908. Ribbentrop's formal education was marked by mediocrity, but his exposure to languages and travel would later set him apart from many of his nationalist peers. From studying French in Metz to skiing in Switzerland and taking private lessons in English, he developed a cosmopolitan air that would eventually draw Hitler's attention. Yet even in these early days, signs of arrogance and entitlement were already forming beneath the polished exterior. By the year 1910, Joachim von Ribbentrop had crossed the Atlantic to North America, where his search for experience and perhaps identity took him through Canada and the United States. For a young man from Prussia, this journey was a turning point that would reshape his ambitions and outlook. In Canada, he worked a series of humble jobs. He served briefly at the Molson's Bank in Montreal, then assisted in engineering tasks related to the Quebec Bridge reconstruction, and later worked for the National Transcontinental Railway. Though these jobs were far from prestigious, they allowed him to observe international systems and lifestyles firsthand. He even tried his hand at journalism in New York and Boston before returning to Germany due to illness. But it was not just labor or language that shaped him abroad. It was the perception of status. He frequently exaggerated his credentials and background, hinting at nobility before he had any right to claim it. In 1925, his distant aunt, Gertrude von Ribbentrop, formally adopted him, giving him the legal right to add the von to his name, a status symbol in Germany associated with aristocracy and social prestige. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 brought Joachim back to Europe. He served with the elite 12th Hussar Regiment of the Prussian Army, eventually earning the Iron Cross for bravery. But while many soldiers returned home seeking peace, Ribbentrop returned with something else: ambition sharpened by war, and a vision of diplomacy built not on peace, but on control. After World War I, Joachim von Ribbentrop's life took a decisive turn, one that combined wealth, status, and opportunity. In the year 1919, he met Anna Elisabeth Henkel, daughter of a prosperous wine producer from Wiesbaden. They married on the 5th of July in the year 1920, and the union opened doors he had long aspired to walk through. The Henkel family's fortune gave Ribbentrop not only financial stability, but also connections to Germany's elite. He traveled widely as a wine merchant and began moving in business and social circles that would eventually overlap with politics. His charm and multilingual fluency in English and French gave him a rare edge in the early post-war years, especially among businessmen and diplomats. Still lacking true nobility, Ribbentrop formally secured his aristocratic claim in 1925 when he was adopted by his aunt Gertrude von Ribbentrop. This adoption legally allowed him to use the name von Ribbentrop, completing his transformation from an ordinary merchant into someone with the appearance of noble descent. By the late 1920s, his path crossed with the rising Nazi movement. Through military contacts from his time in the First World War, Ribbentrop was introduced to Adolf Hitler. Hitler, impressed by his confidence and international exposure, saw in him a useful messenger to the outside world. Though traditional Nazi leaders distrusted him, considering him vain and lacking depth, Ribbentrop's loyalty and ambition aligned perfectly with the party's growing hunger for influence. From wine to power, his journey was only beginning. By the early 1930s, Joachim von Ribbentrop was no longer just a wine merchant with elite connections. He was maneuvering himself into the very heart of Nazi power. His gateway came through an old military acquaintance, Wolf Heinrich von Helldorf, who arranged a meeting between Ribbentrop and Adolf Hitler. The meeting would prove fateful. Unlike many traditional nationalists who looked down on Hitler's populism, Ribbentrop saw an opportunity. He admired Hitler's vision and offered his services as a behind-the-scenes envoy. Although his initial offer was rejected, he persisted, and by late 1932, as Germany's political crisis deepened, his moment arrived. That winter, Ribbentrop opened his Berlin home, Schloss Fuschel, for secret negotiations that helped pave the way for Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January of 1933. Inside Nazi ranks, Ribbentrop was viewed with suspicion. He had not marched with the early party loyalists, and his refined manner and business background stood in stark contrast to the movement's rough-edged veterans. Yet Hitler trusted him. Ribbentrop memorized Hitler's ideas, echoed his views with relentless enthusiasm, and positioned himself as one of the few men who truly understood the Führer. By 1934, Ribbentrop had created the Dienststelle Ribbentrop, a personal foreign affairs office that bypassed the official German foreign ministry. Through this unofficial channel, he began crafting his own version of diplomacy, one rooted in manipulation, showmanship, and loyalty to Hitler above all. His rise was rapid, but it came at a cost, growing resentment from Nazi elites who saw him as an interloper, and a widening rift with Germany's seasoned diplomats. As Adolf Hitler tightened his grip on Germany in the mid-1930s, Joachim von Ribbentrop seized a chance to reshape foreign policy in his own image. In August of 1934, bypassing the established channels of the German foreign ministry, he founded the Dienststelle Ribbentrop, a shadow foreign office staffed with loyalists, former reporters, and young Nazi enthusiasts. Located across from the official foreign office on Wilhelmstrasse, the Dienststelle was more than a building, it was a statement. It operated like an independent embassy, pursuing its own diplomatic missions and courting foreign contacts without consulting traditional diplomats. Through it, Ribbentrop tried to craft a new foreign policy strategy, one not of careful negotiation, but of spectacle and ideological alignment. He particularly focused on Britain, believing that the British aristocracy held secret power over their nation's decisions. He reported back to Hitler that there was strong support among Britain's elite for friendship with the Nazi regime, a gross misreading, but one that pleased Hitler immensely. Ribbentrop's constant affirmation of Hitler's desires made him indispensable, even as other Nazis viewed him with open disdain. Traditional diplomats saw the Dienststelle as a threat, and rightly so. It undermined years of protocol and often sowed confusion in Germany's international relations. But Hitler admired the boldness. To him, The Dienststelle signaled loyalty, initiative, and the revolutionary spirit he prized. For Ribbentrop, it was also a powerful tool, one that gave him influence far beyond his official title and set the stage for even higher office. In October of 1936, Joachim von Ribbentrop was appointed Germany's ambassador to the United Kingdom, a position of prestige and potential, but one that would soon expose his greatest weaknesses. Tasked with securing an Anglo-German alliance, Ribbentrop entered the British court with grand ambitions, but little understanding of its culture, subtlety, or restraint. From the beginning, his approach was clumsy. He misread the ceremonial role of British royalty, mistaking formality for power, and believed that King Edward VIII could shape foreign policy through personal will. He further embarrassed himself by giving the stiff, armed Nazi salute to the king, a blunder that nearly toppled the monarch during a formal handshake. Ribbentrop's time in London was marked by constant social missteps. He alienated tailors, insulted hosts, and surrounded himself with eccentric supporters rather than experienced diplomats. He devoted himself to winning over British aristocrats, convinced they formed a secret society that could sway national policy. His reports to Berlin were full of exaggerated optimism, often citing warm remarks from minor figures while ignoring clear signs of disapproval from actual policymakers. Worse still, he was often absent from London, preferring to stay near Hitler in Berlin, frustrating the British Foreign Office and making diplomatic coordination nearly impossible. British officials and society figures alike viewed him as pompous and detached. Even within the Nazi leadership, his failures in London led Hermann Göring to famously call him a stupid ass. But Hitler remained loyal, still valuing Ribbentrop's flattery and vision of a British-German partnership, even as the dream unraveled. While his mission in Britain faltered, Joachim von Ribbentrop turned his focus eastward to a new alliance that would shift global power. In November of 1936, he signed the anti-Comintern pact with Japan, positioning Germany as a bulwark against communism. Though framed as a stand against the Soviet Union, the pact also revealed a deeper strategy: to unite fascist powers against Western democracies. Ribbentrop was instrumental in shaping this new axis. He forged close ties with the Japanese ambassador and military attaché, Hiroshi Oshima, and worked to transform Germany's foreign policy from a pro-China stance to a firm alignment with Japan. This pivot drew fierce opposition from the traditional German Foreign Office, which favored the existing relationship with the Chinese nationalist government. But Ribbentrop prevailed. The anti-Comintern pact was more than a treaty, it was a symbolic challenge to global order. Invitations were sent to other nations, including Italy, Britain, and Poland, but only Italy would later join. With that, the foundations of the Axis powers were laid. Back in Germany, Ribbentrop used the pact to solidify his influence. It marked a diplomatic win that impressed Hitler and further distanced him from more cautious advisors. For Hitler, it offered a bold vision of a three-part world: Germany dominating Europe, Japan ruling East Asia, and Italy reinforcing both. As Ribbentrop's star rose, so did his ambitions. He saw in the anti-Comintern pact not just a strategic move, but the beginning of a global realignment, one that would bring authoritarian regimes into direct opposition with the old empires of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Despite his many blunders in London, Joachim von Ribbentrop's unwavering devotion to Hitler would soon pay off. By early 1938, Hitler was preparing to centralize power further and needed foreign policy to reflect his radical ambitions. On the 4th of February that year, Ribbentrop was appointed Foreign Minister of Germany, replacing the more cautious and experienced Baron Konstantin von Neurath. To outsiders, the promotion seemed puzzling. Ribbentrop's failures as ambassador were widely known, and his reputation abroad had been damaged beyond repair. British officials mocked him as pompous and naive. But Hitler valued loyalty above competence, and Ribbentrop's readiness to echo and amplify his most extreme views made him the perfect instrument. Ribbentrop immediately set about reshaping the foreign ministry in his image. He replaced veteran diplomats with young Nazi loyalists, many from his old Dienststelle. The tone of German diplomacy shifted overnight, from cautious engagement to threats, ultimatums, and unilateral demands. Ribbentrop viewed compromise as weakness and believed that boldness would compel other nations to submit. One of his first major moves was to realign Germany with Japan more fully. He persuaded Hitler to recognize Japan's puppet state, Manchukuo, and ended Germany's military cooperation with China. This decision angered the army and alienated Germany's Chinese allies, but it reinforced the new alliance that Ribbentrop saw as central to global dominance. In Berlin, his influence was growing fast. No longer a sidelined envoy, Ribbentrop now stood at the core of Nazi power, ready to turn diplomacy into a tool for conquest. With his new authority as foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop quickly became one of the most aggressive voices pushing for territorial expansion. In the year 1938, his attention turned to Czechoslovakia, a young nation carved from the ruins of the First World War. Hitler saw it as an obstacle. Ribbentrop saw it as an opportunity. The Munich Agreement, signed in September of 1938, was presented to the world as a diplomatic triumph, a peaceful settlement that allowed Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland without war. But behind the scenes, Ribbentrop was seething. He believed the agreement was a lost chance to destroy Czechoslovakia entirely, and resented Britain and France for forcing Germany to wait. He referred to the deal as a first-class stupidity, telling close aides that it would have been better to fight Britain in 1938 than risk facing them stronger in a year. This mindset only deepened his hostility toward the Western powers and fueled a more aggressive stance in future negotiations. Following the Munich talks, Ribbentrop moved swiftly. He pressured Slovak leaders to declare independence, used threats to push Hungary into mobilization, and orchestrated a crisis that allowed German troops to march into Prague in March of 1939. Czechoslovakia was no longer just weakened, it was gone, broken into pieces and absorbed by the Reich. In these months, Ribbentrop stopped pretending diplomacy was about peace. His vision was clear: use threats, fear, and manipulation to redraw the map of Europe, one conquest at a time. In the summer of 1939, as Europe braced for conflict, Joachim von Ribbentrop orchestrated one of the most shocking diplomatic moves in modern history, a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Known to the world as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it stunned both allies and enemies and cleared the path for war. For years, Nazi ideology had portrayed communism as its mortal enemy. But Ribbentrop saw the Soviet Union not as a threat, but as a tool, a way to isolate Poland and keep Britain and France from intervening. Working through secret channels, he negotiated directly with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. On the 23rd of August, the two signed a pact in Moscow that promised peace between their nations. What the world didn't know was that the agreement also contained secret protocols. These clauses divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowing Germany to invade Poland from the west, while the Soviets took the east. Ribbentrop toasted Stalin in the Kremlin, smiling beside men he had once called enemies, all in the name of strategic gain. To Hitler, The pact was a green light for war. Just over a week later, on the 1st of September, German forces invaded Poland. 2 days after that, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Ribbentrop had secured short-term victory, but at a long-term cost. He had gambled with trust, ideology, and truth. And in doing so, he helped set Europe ablaze in the opening chapter of World War II. As World War II erupted across Europe, Joachim von Ribbentrop took on the role of Nazi Germany's chief diplomatic architect, orchestrating alliances, justifying invasions, and feeding the chaos that spread from continent to continent. Though his influence would begin to wane by the early 1940s, the war's early years bore his unmistakable imprint. Following the invasion of Poland, Ribbentrop worked tirelessly to keep Germany's allies close. He shuttled between Rome, Tokyo, and other Axis capitals, reinforcing bonds and drawing smaller nations into Germany's orbit. He helped pressure Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria to align with the Nazis, and sought to secure Spain's loyalty through negotiations with Francisco Franco's regime. In late 1941, as tensions escalated between Japan and the United States, Ribbentrop played a direct role in pushing for conflict. He urged the Japanese to break off negotiations with Washington and strike militarily, seeing American involvement as inevitable and believing early action would benefit the Axis. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December, he strongly advocated for Germany to declare war on the United States, and Hitler, trusting his advice, did so. But Ribbentrop's judgment was increasingly questioned. His exaggerated reports to Hitler painted a picture of diplomatic strength that didn't match reality. Many within the Nazi regime, including military leaders, viewed him as out of touch and overly reliant on ideology instead of practical strategy. Still, for a time, he remained central, a man who claimed to wield peace while building the scaffolding of global destruction. His words were calm, his tone polished, but the results were devastating. By the year 1942, Joachim von Ribbentrop's influence within the Nazi regime had begun to unravel. Though he still held the title of foreign minister, the corridors of power were shifting, and his position was increasingly undercut by military setbacks, internal rivalries, and Hitler's growing reliance on other advisors. Ribbentrop's reputation inside the Nazi hierarchy was never strong. Many officials, including Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Goering, viewed him with open disdain. They mocked his pompous behavior, shallow understanding of complex issues, and his habit of parroting Hitler's views without adding insight. Even Hitler, though still supportive, began turning more to the Wehrmacht and the SS for guidance as the war situation worsened. Tensions also grew between Ribbentrop and senior diplomats like Ernst von Weizsäcker, who resisted the more radical aspects of Nazi foreign policy. Ribbentrop responded by purging experienced officials from the foreign ministry and replacing them with loyalists from his old Dienststelle network. But this only weakened Germany's diplomatic capacity at a time when coordination and negotiation were more critical than ever. His obsession with ideological purity over practical diplomacy left him sidelined in key negotiations. Allies such as Italy, Japan, and Hungary became increasingly difficult to manage, and neutral nations lost all faith in Germany's promises. Though still active in official ceremonies and international meetings, Ribbentrop was no longer setting the course. His voice carried less weight, and his earlier confidence began to give way to nervous rigidity. Once a man who believed he could shape global affairs, he was slowly becoming irrelevant, caught between the delusions he had fostered and the reality he could no longer control. As the tide of World War II turned against Germany, Joachim von Ribbentrop found himself increasingly isolated. Once hailed as Hitler's diplomatic weapon, he had become more of a burden than an asset, clinging to power while events slipped far beyond his control. By the year 1943, his role had been reduced to ceremonial gestures and hollow statements. While German cities burned under Allied bombs and Nazi armies were pushed back on every front, Ribbentrop continued issuing unrealistic communiques, speaking of alliances that no longer held and victories that would never come. His attempts to keep Germany's crumbling partnerships intact, with Italy, Hungary, Romania, and others, were met with indifference or outright defiance. Foreign leaders saw him as out of touch, still speaking in the language of threat and loyalty when survival was all they cared about. Inside the Nazi government, Ribbentrop had become a running joke. His long-winded speeches and forced optimism wore thin, even on Hitler, who began to favor direct military leaders like Heinrich Himmler and Albert Speer for strategic counsel. Ribbentrop's diplomatic initiatives were often overridden or ignored, and his own staff quietly distanced themselves from him. Worse still, he failed to see, or refused to see, the enormity of the crimes unfolding under the regime he served. He maintained the facade of diplomacy while genocide and destruction spread behind the scenes. His blindness, whether born of loyalty or self-preservation, only deepened his guilt. No longer the man pulling strings behind closed doors, Ribbentrop had become a hollow figure in a collapsing empire, desperately trying to act like the diplomat he once believed himself to be. By early 1945, as the Allies closed in from both east and west, Nazi Germany was in ruins, and so was the career of Joachim von Ribbentrop. Once Hitler's chosen voice to the world, he now found himself cut off, powerless and irrelevant. The Reich was collapsing, and there was no room left for diplomacy. Berlin was bombed daily, its government fractured and its citizens starving. Even Hitler no longer trusted those closest to him, including Ribbentrop. In the final days of the regime, the foreign minister made one last desperate attempt to secure peace through backdoor negotiations, trying to reach out to Sweden and Switzerland, hoping they could mediate a separate peace. But no one listened. His messages went unanswered, and his name carried no weight. When Hitler took his own life in April, Ribbentrop was not at his side. He had fled Berlin, moving between hiding places with forged documents and little direction. He shaved his mustache, changed his appearance, and tried to disappear into the chaos of a defeated nation. But it was too late. In June of 1945, British forces captured him near Hamburg. In his possession were fake papers and a desperate letter claiming he had tried to serve Germany honorably. He was arrested without incident, no longer a feared minister, but a fugitive whose time had run out. Joachim von Ribbentrop had begun his journey as a merchant with grand dreams. He ended it as a man on the run, facing the consequences of the empire he helped build and the terror he helped unleash. After his capture in June of 1945, Joachim von Ribbentrop was handed over to Allied forces and transported to face justice. His destination was Nuremberg, the site of the most significant war crimes tribunal in modern history. Once Germany's chief diplomat, he now stood accused of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. At the International Military Tribunal, Ribbentrop was among the first and most prominent Nazi leaders to be tried. He sat in the dock beside men who had shaped the regime's darkest acts, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and others. Unlike some co-defendants who showed remorse or tried to distance themselves from Hitler, Ribbentrop remained stubborn and loyal, insisting that he had only followed orders and served his country. but the evidence was overwhelming. The court presented documents he had signed, memos he had authored, and testimony proving his direct involvement in Nazi Germany's aggressive expansion and the deportation of Jews and political enemies. His role in securing the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact and in pressuring weaker nations into submission left little room for defense. On the 1st of October in the year 1946, the tribunal found him guilty on all major counts. He was sentenced to death by hanging. In the early hours of the 16th of October, he was led to the gallows and became the first among the condemned to be executed. His final words were defiant, clinging to his belief in the Reich, even in the face of justice. But history remembers him not for honor or courage, but as a man who twisted diplomacy into a weapon and helped ignite the deadliest conflict the world has ever known. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Arthur Seyss-Inquart of Austria was born on the 22nd of July in the year 1892 in Stannern, a village located in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now part of the Czech Republic. How did a trained lawyer from the provinces rise to become one of Adolf Hitler's most trusted civilian administrators? What drew Seyss-Inquart so deeply into the heart of the Nazi machine? And how did a man once seen as a cautious bureaucrat become one of the most brutal collaborators in occupied Europe? Arthur Seyss-Inquart grew up in a German-speaking family steeped in conservative, nationalist ideals. Though his birthplace was far from Vienna's grand palaces, he was raised with a strong belief in loyalty to empire, order, and hierarchy. He studied law in Vienna, where he developed a reputation for discipline and discretion rather than flair. His world changed in 1914 when war broke out across Europe. Seyss-Inquart volunteered for military service and served as a front-line officer in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I. He was wounded multiple times and decorated for bravery, emerging from the trenches as a man deeply committed to Germanic unity and military honor. These experiences shaped his worldview, one where obedience and structure were paramount. After the war, he returned to law but kept one foot in politics. Quietly, he began building connections with nationalist groups disillusioned by Austria's new republic. Though not yet a Nazi, Seyss-Inquart's path was set: loyalty to the German cause, disdain for democracy, and an unshakable belief that destiny favored the strong. Arthur Seyss-Inquart's journey into political power began not with fiery speeches or mass rallies, but in the quiet halls of Vienna's universities. After returning from World War I, he completed his law degree at the University of Vienna, graduating in an Austria still reeling from the collapse of its imperial identity. The empire he had once fought for was gone, and in its place stood a small, fragile republic. As a young lawyer in the early 1920s, Seyss-Inquart built a career rooted in administrative precision and careful networking. He avoided public controversy and kept a low profile, aligning himself with conservative nationalists who longed for Anschluss, the union of Austria and Germany. While he never joined the early Nazi party, he remained sympathetic to their cause, seeing them as a force that could restore order and pride. He married and started a family, all while moving steadily through Vienna's legal circles. He gained a reputation for being loyal, discreet, and politically adaptable, traits that made him attractive to both state officials and underground nationalist movements. Unlike the fiery radicals of the time, Seyss-Inquart worked patiently, waiting for the right moment to emerge. By the early 1930s, Austria was a country divided between authoritarian government, leftist opposition, and growing Nazi influence. Seyss-Inquart kept one foot in each world, acting as a quiet bridge between the existing state and the rising tide of German nationalism. His legal mind, calm demeanor, and Austrian identity made him a unique asset, and when the winds shifted, he was ready to move with them. In the turbulent political climate of the early 1930s, Austria was on the edge of collapse. Polarized between socialist unrest and authoritarian control, the nation teetered between civil strife and foreign pressure. It was in this fragile environment that Arthur Seyss-Inquart stepped into the world of politics, not with a dramatic entrance, but with calculated precision. He did not join the Nazi Party immediately, wary of its outlaw status in Austria. Instead, he aligned himself with legal nationalist groups sympathetic to German unification. His growing influence caught the attention of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who led an authoritarian regime that banned both Nazis and social democrats. Ironically, it was under Dollfuss that Seyss-Inquart began his political climb. By 1933, he was working behind the scenes, serving as a legal advisor and intermediary between conservative officials and the underground Nazi movement. He maintained a careful balance, publicly supporting Austria's sovereignty while privately believing in the inevitability of Anschluss. His gift was subtlety. He avoided loud declarations, preferring technical arguments and quiet persuasion. After Dollfuss was assassinated by Nazi sympathizers in 1934, Seyss-Inquart kept his distance from the violence, but his connections to Germany deepened. He became known in Berlin as a reliable, German-friendly Austrian, someone who could help bring Austria into the fold without alienating its elites. By the mid-1930s, his political identity was clear: a nationalist who cloaked ambition in civility, a bureaucrat who believed Austria's future lay not in independence, but in union with Hitler's growing Reich. By the late 1930s, Arthur Seyss-Inquart's quiet loyalty to the idea of Anschluss, the union of Austria and Germany, had made him a trusted figure in Berlin. Though not yet a full member of the Nazi Party, his consistent alignment with Hitler's goals and his influence within Austrian politics made him a valuable asset. It was a role he embraced not out of blind ideology, but as a calculated step toward personal and national destiny. In early 1938, as Hitler intensified pressure on the Austrian government to allow unification, Seyss-Inquart emerged as the bridge between the two countries. He had cultivated relationships with German officials for years, and now those connections would pay off. Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, desperate to avoid bloodshed, reluctantly appointed Seyss-Inquart as Minister of the Interior, placing him in control of Austria's police and security forces. From that moment, Seyss-Inquart worked carefully to prepare the ground for a Nazi takeover. When Schuschnigg called for a national referendum to reject unification, Hitler was enraged. On the 11th of March, under mounting threats from Germany, Schuschnigg resigned. Seyss-Inquart was installed as Chancellor by presidential decree, a move orchestrated entirely by Berlin. Though he held the office for only 2 days, his role was crucial. He invited German troops into Austria, declaring that peace and order had to be maintained. The next morning, German forces crossed the border without resistance. The Anschluss had begun, not with battle, but with signatures, speeches, and the quiet compliance of men like Seyss-Inquart. On the 12th of March in the year 1938, German troops entered Austria to thunderous applause. The event, later known as the Anschluss, marked the formal unification of Austria with Nazi Germany, and it propelled Arthur Seyss-Inquart from a bureaucrat into a central figure of Hitler's expanding empire. The transition was swift. After just 2 days as Chancellor, Seyss-Inquart welcomed Hitler to Vienna as a returning hero. He stood by the Führer's side during public appearances and rallies, presenting himself as the architect of peaceful unification. His reward came immediately. Hitler appointed him Reichsstatthalter, or governor of Austria, giving him nearly absolute power under the new regime. In this new role, Seyss-Inquart oversaw the rapid Nazification of Austria. He dissolved political parties, banned newspapers, and directed the arrest of political opponents, Jews, and dissidents. Though he portrayed the changes as necessary for order, they mirrored the same brutal tactics used in Germany. Synagogues were vandalized, property was seized, and Austrian Jews were targeted with increasing violence. Seyss-Inquart worked closely with Heinrich Himmler and other top Nazi officials to integrate Austria into the Reich's bureaucratic machinery. He restructured the education system, replaced civil servants with loyal Nazis, and promoted racial policies that stripped thousands of their rights. Always the lawyer, he ensured these actions were cloaked in legality, but their cruelty was unmistakable. What began as a legal maneuver had turned into a full-scale purge. Seyss-Inquart, once a silent nationalist, had now become a willing executor of Hitler's vision, and Austria became the first step in a much darker journey across Europe. Following the Anschluss, Arthur Seyss-Inquart ruled Austria not as an independent leader, but as Hitler's appointed governor, a Reichsstatthalter tasked with reshaping his homeland into a loyal province of the Nazi Empire. From March of 1938 onward, Austria was no longer a nation, but a district of the Reich, and Seyss-Inquart was its enforcer. He oversaw sweeping changes that transformed every aspect of Austrian life. Jewish citizens were expelled from universities, barred from professions, and stripped of property. Seyss-Inquart issued decrees targeting their rights, cloaking persecution in legal language. Under his leadership, nearly 200,000 Jews were driven from Austria in just over a year, many fleeing with little more than the clothes they wore. He also restructured Austria's government, culture, and economy to mirror Nazi Germany's model. Political opposition was outlawed, schools were infused with Nazi ideology, and the press became a mouthpiece for propaganda. Austrian identity was suppressed, replaced by slogans of unity with the Reich. Yet Seyss-Inquart maintained a public image of calm authority. He often spoke in measured tones, presenting himself as a civil servant fulfilling legal obligations. But behind the polished words stood a man deeply involved in repression. He approved arrests, deportations, and confiscations, and worked closely with the SS to ensure Austria's full compliance with Nazi racial policies. For many Austrians, life under Seyss-Inquart became a daily experience of fear, surveillance, and loss. What he called governance was, in truth, the efficient machinery of totalitarian rule, and Austria, under his guidance, became a proving ground for what the Nazis would soon inflict on all of Europe. By early 1939, Arthur Seyss-Inquart's work in Austria had earned him greater trust within the Nazi hierarchy. His ability to quietly transform a sovereign nation into a compliant Nazi province made him a model governor in Hitler's eyes. That reputation followed him as Germany turned its attention to the east, toward Czechoslovakia. After months of political pressure and border provocations, Hitler made his next move. In March of 1939, German forces entered what remained of Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland had already been annexed the previous year, but now the Nazis occupied the rest and created the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Though Seyss-Inquart was not placed at the top of this new territory, he played an advisory and transitional role during its establishment. His administrative style, blending legal structures with authoritarian control, influenced how Nazi rule was implemented in Prague. His experience in Vienna became a blueprint for how to dismantle institutions and replace them with loyalty to Berlin. While others took command in the Protectorate, Seyss-Inquart remained closely involved in Nazi expansion policy. He began participating in high-level meetings where the fate of entire regions was discussed like pieces on a chessboard. His voice carried weight when legal justifications were needed for military action, occupation, or racial laws. By the time German tanks rolled through Prague, Seyss-Inquart had become more than just a local governor. He was a trusted executor of Hitler's vision, a man who had proven that nations could be absorbed not only with violence, but with pens, papers, and carefully staged obedience. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, the world was plunged into war. For Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the conflict marked another opportunity for advancement. Though not placed in charge of the entire Polish territory, he was assigned a critical role within the newly occupied region, serving as deputy to Hans Frank in the general government, the Nazi administration established in central Poland. This was not a glamorous position, but it was one of immense power. Seyss-Inquart was responsible for overseeing civil administration, including economic management, legal structuring, and enforcement of German policies. The region quickly became a testing ground for the Nazi regime's most brutal experiments in racial control and economic exploitation. He worked hand in hand with Frank and the SS, coordinating the confiscation of Polish property, suppression of the intelligentsia, and early efforts to segregate and deport Jewish populations. Though the worst horrors of the Holocaust had not yet begun, the machinery was being assembled, and Seyss-Inquart helped lay the groundwork. His legal expertise was again employed to give the appearance of legitimacy. He issued decrees that displaced millions, facilitated forced labor, and expanded German control over Polish institutions. Resistance was met with swift violence, and entire communities were uprooted under his watch. Despite this powerful position, Seyss-Inquart viewed his time in Poland as temporary. He remained ambitious, angling for a post that would give him full authority. That chance came soon. As war spread across Europe, Hitler needed trusted men to oversee the occupied West, and Seyss-Inquart was about to be sent to a nation where resistance ran deep and cruelty would define his rule. In May of 1940, German forces overran the Netherlands after just 5 days of fierce resistance. The country fell swiftly, but its spirit of independence endured. Into this tense atmosphere stepped Arthur Seyss-Inquart, appointed by Hitler as Reichskommissar, the highest Nazi authority in the occupied Netherlands. It was the most powerful role he had ever held. From his headquarters in The Hague, Seyss-Inquart oversaw nearly every aspect of Dutch life. His job was to enforce German control while maintaining a veneer of cooperation. At first, he attempted a softer approach, allowing the Dutch civil service to remain and promising stability. But beneath the surface, he moved quickly to dismantle democracy and silence opposition. He banned political parties, censored the press, and began identifying targets for racial policy. Jews, communists, and resistance organizers were placed under surveillance. At the same time, he initiated a program of Germanization, aiming to mold Dutch society into a loyal outpost of the Reich. Unlike Austria, where some welcomed unification, the Dutch resisted from the start. Seyss-Inquart responded with increasing harshness. He expanded the SS presence, empowered local collaborators, and approved the arrest of thousands. His administration became known not for diplomacy, but for repression. Still, he cloaked his rule in legal terms, signing decrees instead of giving fiery speeches. But each signature carried weight, leading to deportations, imprisonments, and executions. In the Netherlands, Seyss-Inquart moved beyond policy into punishment. No longer just a bureaucrat of empire, he became one of the most feared figures in occupied Western Europe. Arthur Seyss-Inquart's early attempts to win Dutch cooperation quickly gave way to harsher measures as the reality of occupation set in. By late 1940, resistance groups had begun forming across the Netherlands, distributing underground newspapers, sabotaging supply lines, and aiding Jews in hiding. Seyss-Inquart responded with calculated brutality. He approved wide-ranging security measures that allowed for collective punishment, secret trials, and executions without appeal. Entire neighborhoods were raided for harboring partisans or printing resistance material. When German officers were attacked, dozens of civilians were shot in retaliation, often chosen at random. Seyss-Inquart framed these actions as necessary responses to terrorism, but their true purpose was fear. At the same time, he cultivated Dutch collaborators, particularly from the National Socialist movement in the Netherlands, NSB. He gave them local power, allowed them to control civil institutions, and relied on them to identify and report Jewish families and dissidents. With their help, Nazi policy was embedded deep into everyday Dutch life. Despite these tactics, Dutch resistance only grew. The hiding of Jewish children, sabotage of railroads, and refusal to cooperate with German labor demands became widespread. Seyss-Inquart tightened the noose. He oversaw mass arrests, deportations to concentration camps, and the destruction of entire communities. What set him apart was his ability to maintain a calm, legalistic image, even as he approved policies that destroyed lives. He rarely gave fiery speeches, but his signature on a single document could condemn hundreds. In the Netherlands, his name became synonymous with quiet cruelty, a man who ruled not through chaos, but with cold, methodical repression. By the early 1940s, Arthur Seyss-Inquart's administration in the Netherlands had become one of the most efficient engines of Nazi oppression in Western Europe. At the center of his rule was the systematic persecution of the Dutch Jewish population, a tragedy now remembered as the Dutch Holocaust. Under his authority, over 100,000 Jews were deported from the Netherlands, with nearly 75% never returning. Seyss-Inquart issued decrees requiring Jews to register, wear yellow stars, and relocate to designated ghettos. He oversaw the confiscation of their homes, businesses, and possessions, stripping them not only of citizenship, but of dignity. Working alongside Adolf Eichmann's deportation unit and Dutch collaborators, he coordinated the transportation of Jews to transit camps such as Westerbork and Vught. From there, they were sent east to Auschwitz, Sobibor, and other death camps. Entire families vanished, their names erased by rail schedules and cold bureaucracy. Beyond the Jewish population, Seyss-Inquart's policies extended to political prisoners and resistance fighters. Executions increased. Hostages were routinely shot in reprisal for acts of sabotage. Laborers were deported to Germany for forced work under brutal conditions. Yet through it all, Seyss-Inquart maintained his facade of legal order. He claimed to be protecting the country from chaos, insisting that every action was part of maintaining peace. But the truth was clear. His rule brought death to thousands and fear to millions. His calm demeanor masked a monstrous efficiency. Under the quiet strokes of his pen, one of Europe's most liberal nations was transformed into a place of terror, and the Dutch people paid the ultimate price. By 1943, the tide of World War II was shifting. After defeats in North Africa and setbacks on the Eastern Front, the once unshakable German advance began to falter. For Arthur Seyss-Inquart in the Netherlands, the changing winds brought new challenges and growing desperation. The Dutch resistance, emboldened by news of Allied victories, intensified its efforts. Sabotage operations targeted railroads, communication lines, and German supply depots. Underground newspapers circulated openly, and more citizens joined the fight against occupation. Seyss-Inquart responded with heightened brutality, ordering mass arrests, deportations, and swift reprisals. Each attack was met with executions, each protest crushed by fear. At the same time, his ability to maintain full control began to fray. Food shortages led to widespread hunger, and Dutch morale grew more defiant. The German war machine, stretched thin, could no longer provide the same resources or manpower to enforce absolute order. Seyss-Inquart leaned more heavily on the SS and Dutch collaborators, but cracks were forming in his once stable regime. Behind closed doors, he grew more isolated. Though still loyal to Hitler, he was no longer part of the inner circle shaping the Reich's future. His role became one of maintenance, holding a collapsing front with fewer tools and growing resistance. Yet even as the war turned against the Nazis, Seyss-Inquart showed no signs of retreat. He doubled down on executions, authorized stricter rationing, and continued enforcing Nazi racial policies. As the world moved toward liberation, he clung to the dying vision of German dominance, blind to the ruin closing in around him. By early 1945, the German Reich was crumbling. Allied forces pushed in from the west, the Soviets advanced from the east, and the days of Nazi occupation were numbered. In the Netherlands, Arthur Seyss-Inquart faced the collapse of everything he had worked to build. But even in these final moments, he refused to loosen his grip. Despite widespread starvation and destruction, Seyss-Inquart maintained strict control. The infamous Hunger Winter of 1944 to 1945 saw tens of thousands of Dutch citizens die from malnutrition. He denied relief efforts, blocked food shipments, and used famine as a weapon to suppress resistance. The cruelty was no longer hidden, it was direct, desperate, and undeniable. As Allied forces approached, Seyss-Inquart began shifting his tone. No longer certain of victory, he attempted to present himself as a pragmatic negotiator. In the spring of 1945, he entered discussions with Allied representatives through intermediaries, including members of the Dutch government in exile and the Red Cross. He allowed limited humanitarian aid into the Netherlands through Operation Manna, an aerial food drop coordinated with British and American forces. But this gesture, made under pressure, did little to erase the suffering he had caused. While others fled or surrendered, Seyss-Inquart clung to his post until the very end. He ordered the destruction of infrastructure, the execution of prisoners, and the continuation of policies that no longer served any strategic purpose. To the bitter end, he remained loyal to the collapsing Reich, a man who once ruled through law now presiding over chaos, unable or unwilling to stop the devastation closing in on him. In the final days of the war, Arthur Seyss-Inquart's world unraveled. As German forces surrendered across Europe in May of 1945, he remained in the Netherlands, one of the last high-ranking Nazi officials still clinging to power. But with Hitler dead and the Reich in ruins, Seyss-Inquart's authority collapsed almost overnight. On the 7th of May, he was arrested near Hamburg by British forces. He offered no resistance. The man who once ruled entire nations with cold efficiency now found himself a prisoner, silent, controlled, and awaiting judgment. Transferred to Allied custody, he was held at Mondorf-les-Bains in Luxembourg, alongside other top Nazi officials. During his confinement, Seyss-Inquart was calm and calculating. Interrogators noted his legal mind, his willingness to explain and justify his actions. He claimed he had only followed orders, had worked within the law, and had acted in the best interests of the people under his rule. But the evidence said otherwise. Allied investigators gathered records of deportations, executions, and policies signed by his hand. Victims' testimonies, captured documents, and his own speeches left no doubt about the role he played. He was soon transferred to Nuremberg, where the world's most infamous war crimes tribunal was being assembled. Seyss-Inquart, once the voice of quiet tyranny, now sat behind bars among the architects of genocide. Stripped of titles, uniforms, and influence, he was no longer a governor or minister, just a man facing the weight of history and the consequences of calculated cruelty. The trial ahead would determine not only his fate, but his place in the darkest chapters of modern civilization. Arthur Seyss-Inquart arrived in Nuremberg in 1945 to face justice before the International Military Tribunal, a court assembled by the Allies to prosecute the highest-ranking architects of the Nazi regime. Alongside men like Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Rudolf Hess, Seyss-Inquart was charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Throughout the trial, he remained composed, presenting himself as a man of law, not violence. He claimed he had not participated in mass killings, that he had merely followed orders, and that his legal expertise had been used to stabilize regions, not destroy them. But the prosecution laid out overwhelming evidence, orders he had signed, policies he had enforced, and the horrific consequences of his rule in the Netherlands and Austria. Eyewitness testimonies described the deportation of Jews, the execution of hostages, and the starvation of civilians during the Hunger Winter. His calm demeanor in court could not erase years of terror inflicted under his command. On the 1st of October 1946, Seyss-Inquart was sentenced to death by hanging. In his final statement, he expressed regret, but continued to insist that he had tried to act within the law, a claim that rang hollow to the millions who had suffered under his authority. He was executed on the 16th of October, 1946, at Nuremberg prison. As the noose tightened around his neck, the curtain fell on a man who had wielded quiet cruelty behind legal words and bureaucratic power. Seyss-Inquart's life was a chilling reminder that evil does not always come in loud declarations. Sometimes it signs its name at the bottom of a page, hidden behind polished manners and an official title. His end marked not just punishment, but the final rejection of the lies he used to shield horror. What do you think about Joachim von Ribbentrop of Germany? Was Ribbentrop a determined diplomat, a man who believed in reshaping the world through bold alliances and political strategy, placing his loyalty above all else? Or was he a misguided figure, swept up in power, deluded by ambition, and ultimately remembered as a symbol of reckless loyalty that led to destruction? And what about Arthur Seyss-Inquart of Austria? Was Seyss-Inquart a calculated legal mind who rose through the ranks with discipline and control, using law as a tool to bring order and authority to a collapsing empire? Or a silent architect of suffering, hidden behind titles and treaties, who masked cruelty with calm words and left a trail of pain across the lands he governed? Were these men visionaries caught in the storm of history, or careful opportunists who helped unleash it? Did their choices reflect conviction or the quiet horrors of obedience wrapped in reason? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past, stories of ambition, betrayal, and the shadows behind history's greatest upheavals. Thank you so much for watching.